Ever catch yourself wondering what makes you you? And like, not just your body, right? But that thinking feeling part, the me inside.
It's a question that's echoed for centuries,
And it's exactly what this guy Aristotle tackles in his work on the soul.
which I have to say is way more engaging than dusty old scrolls might suggest.
No kidding. So we're diving deep into book one in this deep dive, laying the groundwork for understanding this whole soul business.
And what's amazing is how he starts, not by just laying out his ideas.
Oh, no way. He goes full on philosopher detective.
Exactly. He picks apart all the bad theories floating around back then.
Like a greatest hits of philosophical fails, all leading up to his own take. Adds a bit of drama, don't you think?
Definitely keeps you hooked.
Yeah.
And honestly, his approach is still so relevant. In today's world, we're bombarded with information, opinions.
It's like information overload. So knowing how to think critically, how to spot a shaky argument.
That's essential. And Aristotle shows us how it's done.
He's like the OG critical thinking guru. But okay, back to souls. He starts by admitting we can't just point to a soul like it's a lamppost, right?
Precisely. He dives right into that what is it problem. You can't examine a house the same way you'd study, say, a painting.
Because one's all about structure and bricks, and the other's about how colors and shapes make you feel something. Different approaches.
Exactly. And the soul. Well, that's even more slippery. Aristotle even questions whether to start with its functions, like thinking, sensing.
Or do you try to pinpoint its parts, assuming it has parts?
Then there's the question of its relationship to the body. Can they be separated? Do they act on each other? It gets complicated fast.
Okay, so he's established that figuring out the soul is hard. But, being Aristotle, he doesn't just throw up his hands. He's got to tackle those existing theories. Like, what about the idea that the soul is what makes things move in?
Ah, yes, the soul in motion camp. A popular one back then. Thinkers like Democritus, who had this idea about tiny, indivisible particles called atoms.
Oh, right, like the basic building blocks of everything.
Exactly. He figured the soul was made of superfine, mobile atoms constantly buzzing about, and those animated the body.
I kind of get it. Like those dust motes dancing in a sunbeam. All that frantic energy.
It's a vivid image. And breathing played a big part in this theory, too. That constant motion of air, essential for life, seemed connected to this idea of the soul as a source of movement.
Okay, but Aristotle wasn't buying it, right? Like, it's not as if our souls are literally sprinting on a tiny track inside us, making us move.
He saw right through that. He uses a clever analogy.
Yeah.
Sailors on a ship, they're moving, right?
Only because the ship is, not because they're each rowing themselves across the ocean.
Precisely. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing different kinds of motion, different causes. Just because the soul might be the origin of movement in a living thing.
Doesn't mean it itself is zooming around inside. Okay, that makes sense. But then what about all that stuff going on inside us? Thoughts, emotions, they kind of feel like movement too, right? Like something's happening.
A very astute observation. Aristotle tackled that head on. It's tempting to say, oh, my soul feels sad, or my soul's excited.
But he's got a problem with that phrasing, doesn't he?
It's a subtle but crucial distinction. Aristotle says it's more accurate to say, I feel sad with my soul, or I think with my soul.
So it's less that the soul itself is doing the feeling, more like it's the thing that allows us to have feelings at all.
Exactly. He's highlighting this close, inseparable link between our mind and body, which, if you think about it, makes the whole defining the soul problem even trickier.
Totally. And this is before he even gets to the idea of the soul being a number. I gotta be honest, that's where I started getting lost.
It sounds bizarre at first. But remember, the ancient Greeks were fascinated by numbers, their order, their perfection.
Right, like math was their love language or something.
Pretty much. So some philosophers propose that the soul must be a special kind of number, one that's always changing, flowing.
But also eternal, unchanging in its essence. I guess I can kind of see the logic there.
The problem is, Aristotle points out, numbers are abstract. They don't cause things to move in the real world.
Saying a number is moving is like saying the number 7 can bake a cake. They're just different categories.
Precisely. And that leads him to dismantle another popular theory. The idea that the soul is made up of the basic elements like earth, air, fire, and water.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. Like we're microcosms of the universe, reflecting all those elements in our very being.
Exactly. Empedocles, a pretty influential thinker back then, was all about this. He even put it quite poetically, actually. For 'tis by earth we see earth, by water, water, by ether, ether divine, by fire, destructive fire.
Okay, that's pretty beautiful. I'll give him that.
Right? It's this idea that our souls are composed of these elements so that we can perceive and understand the world around us, which is also made up of those elements.
I can see where he's coming from. Like, we're literally made of the same stuff as the cosmos. It's a very poetic way of looking at it. But Aristotle wasn't fully on board, was he?
Not quite. He saw a flaw in that logic. Just because our souls, hypothetically, contain these elements doesn't explain how we can perceive or understand them in their more complex forms.
It's like saying, well, my house is made of wood and mail, so obviously I must be an architect. I might know what wood is, but that doesn't mean I understand load-bearing walls or anything.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Aristotle uses a similar example. He talks about bone. Bone, he says, is made of certain elements, right?
Like, I'm sure there's some calcium in there, other stuff.
But Aristotle's point is, just because those elements are present in the soul, well, that doesn't automatically give the soul the knowledge of what a bone is.
Right, or how it works, or why it's shaped that way. It's like having the ingredients doesn't make you a chef, right? There's a process of understanding, of putting it all together that's missing from that theory.
Exactly. And this is where Aristotle starts to shift gears a bit. He's poked holes in this idea of the soul being made of literal physical stuff, whether it's atoms or elements. So now he's setting the stage for his own view.
Okay, so buckle up, everyone. Aristotle's about to drop some wisdom on us.
And it starts with him tackling another popular theory, the idea of the soul as harmony.
Oh, like our bodies are musical instruments, and the soul is the beautiful music they make when they're all in tune. I've heard that one before. It's a nice thought.
It is, and it was quite popular back then. Thinkers would point to the body's balanced state, how all the different parts work together, and say, see, that's harmony. That's the soul at work.
But something tells me Aristotle wasn't quite sold on this either.
You know Aristotle. He always has a counter-argument. And with the harmony theory, he argues that, sure, it's a nice way to describe a healthy, functioning body, but...
But it's not the whole picture. Like, it can't explain everything the soul does.
Exactly. How do you explain a screaming toddler tantrum in terms of harmony? Or the feeling of falling head over heels in love? Those are intense, messy experiences.
It'd be like saying a roller coaster is just a harmonious blend of gravity and physics. Technically true, but it misses the visceral emotional experience.
Precisely. He argues that emotions often involve physical changes. Your heart rate goes up, you get butterflies in your stomach. To call that harmony seems a bit off.
Okay, so we've ruled out movement, numbers, elements, and even beautiful music. What's left? If the soul isn't any of those things, what is it, according to Aristotle?
Well, this is where his own view starts to take shape. And instead of trying to define the soul as a separate thing, he shifts the focus to its relationship with the body.
Okay, so less about what it is, more about what it does.
Exactly. Aristotle argues that the soul is what makes a body alive. It's the principle of life itself.
So, in a way, it's not a thing you can hold or dissect. It's more like the animating force behind it all.
You've got it. It's the difference between a living being and, say, a rock. And this leads him to propose different kinds of souls, each with its own capacities, based on how alive something is.
Different kinds of souls, like different flavors.
More like different levels of complexity. The most basic kind he calls the nutritive soul. And this is what plants have.
Okay, so even plants have souls, according to Aristotle.
Yes, they might not be composing symphonies, but they're alive, right? They grow, they take in nourishment, they reproduce.
So their souls are more about those basic life functions.
Exactly. Then you have animals. And animals, he says, have that nutritive soul too, of course, but they also have something extra, a sensitive soul.
The sensitive soul, what does that do? Makes them extra polite.
Not quite. The sensitive soul is what allows animals to perceive the world around them through their senses. And crucially, it's also what gives them the capacity to feel emotions.
So that's where my dog's dramatic sighs when he doesn't get table scraps come from, his sensitive soul.
Exactly. Animals experience the world, they feel things, they're driven by instincts, desires, even rudimentary forms of communication.
So they're not just fancy houseplants, they've got that extra layer of experience going on.
Exactly. And this brings us to us, humans. Where do we fit into this whole soul hierarchy, you might ask?
Well, I'm guessing we're not at the bottom with the ferns.
Not quite. Aristotle believed humans stand at the top of this ladder. Because in addition to the nutritive and sensitive souls...
We've got something extra special.
We do. He calls it the rational soul. This is the big one, the game changer. So we've got humans sitting pretty at the top with this bonus rational soul. But Aristotle doesn't just stop there.
Of course not. Wouldn't be a very good deep dive if we just got a ranking of soul types and called it a day.
Exactly. He wants to know how these different souls work together, especially within us, complex humans.
Right, because it's one thing to say, okay, I've got a bit of plant soul, dash of dog soul, and a whole lot of thinking soul on top.
But how do those actually interact? It's not like they clock in and out for different shifts, right?
Yeah, like, does my nutritive soul just go on autopilot when I'm trying to solve a crossword puzzle?
That's precisely the kind of question Aristotle was interested in. He uses this example of building a house. You might think, house building, that's got to be all rational soul, right?
Yeah.
Planning, designing.
Blueprints, measuring twice, cutting once, all that jazz.
Exactly. But Aristotle argues that even in those seemingly purely rational activities, well, the other parts of the soul are still there, humming along in the background.
They don't just peace out and leave the rational soul to its own devices.
Nope. Your senses are still taking in information about the wood, the nails, maybe even enjoying the smell of sawdust.
And I bet there's some emotional stuff going on too. Pride in a well-built wall, maybe frustration when a board splinters.
Precisely. It's not about separate departments, more like a team effort. Each part of the soul, even the seemingly basic ones, contributes to the final product.
Okay, so it's less soul hierarchy and more soul collaborative. I like that. But there's got to be some division of labor, right? Like, how does sensation, just experiencing the world, lead to big abstract thoughts? That's where the rational soul really shines, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Aristotle was particularly fascinated by this connection between our senses and our ability to think. But he was careful to point out that our senses aren't just passively absorbing information like a sponge.
There's more to it than just, like, eye sees, send data to brain, brain says tree.
Way more to it. Aristotle argued that our senses actually participate in how we perceive and understand the world.
Okay, now you've lost me. What does that even mean, senses participating? They're just...
Think about it this way. Take color, for example. It's not just that our eyes detect certain wavelengths of light. It's that our sensitive soul interprets those wavelengths as a particular color.
So the eye's doing its job, but then the sensitive soul steps in and puts a label on it, gives it meaning.
In a way, yes. And that interpretation, Aristotle argues, is influenced by all sorts of things. Our past experiences, our emotional state, even our cultural background.
That's making me think about how different people react to the same color. Like, green might be calming to one person, but reminds someone else of a bad breakup. Same color, totally different meaning.
Exactly. And those individual differences in perception, according to Aristotle, highlight just how active our sensitive soul is in shaping our experience of the world. It's not just a passive intake of data.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So those sensory experiences, all filtered through individual sensitive soul lens, that's the raw material that our rational soul uses to do its thinking.
You got it. It's like
Yeah.
the senses provide the ingredients, and the rational soul is the master chef, taking those ingredients and whipping up complex thoughts, ideas, even philosophical theories.
So in a way, our rational soul wouldn't be able to do much at all without the sensitive soul feeding it all that information.
That's kind of humbling, isn't it? It is. And it reminds us that for Aristotle, the soul isn't this separate ethereal thing. It's all bound up with our physical bodies, our senses, our emotions. It's what makes us alive, what drives us to act, to think, to be in the world.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground here, from tiny atoms to the interconnectedness of our senses and thoughts. Aristotle really didn't make it easy for us, did he?
He did love a good philosophical puzzle. But that's the beauty of his work. Even thousands of years later, it still challenges us to think deeply about what it means to be human.
It's a good reminder that even with all our modern technology, brain scans and whatnot, we're still grappling with the same fundamental questions about ourselves that Aristotle was wrestling with way back when.
And maybe, just maybe, his approach, his emphasis on observation, critical thinking, and recognizing the complexity of the soul, that's still the best roadmap we've got for navigating those big questions.
Deep stuff. Well, on that note, huge thanks to you for guiding us through Aristotle's On the Soul. Always a pleasure to dive deep with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to everyone listening, keep those brains buzzing. There's a whole lot of fascinating stuff out there just waiting to be explored. Until next time.